There's been a lot of work linking diversification models to the origins of species diversity by showing a correlation between diversification patterns and some deterministic or random process. But there's been a lot less work examining how well particular diversification models fit empirical data. And it's also unclear how much diversification patterns produced by different processes will vary from one another. We took a spatially explicit approach to testing alternate diversification scenarios of birds in the neotropics due to this area's extraordinary biodiversity and complex landscape. And in this tree, you can see some of the many lowland rainforest birds in the area, highlighting the biodiversity here. And then listed below are just a few of the many mechanisms that have been studied to help explain this diversity. But what hasn't really been assessed is how well these models fit the data and what level of variation do we expect these models to produce. So one of the reasons spatially explicit tests of biogeographic models are uncommon is it's very computationally intensive. So we've put together an automated pipeline bringing different software elements together to simulate across 3 spatial scenarios that represent different stochastic and deterministic diversification patterns. And I'll go into the detail on these 3 spatial scenarios on the next slide. To simulate across our 3 scenarios, we need a landscape map that shows suitable areas, as well as some biological information about the species that we're simulating speciation for, including their growth rate and dispersal probability. And after we ran our simulations across our 3 spatial scenarios, we then simulated DNA sequences, we estimated gene trees, we calculated some different summary statistics, and then we performed ABC model selection. So this first spatial scenario that we looked at was the Amazon landscape without any geographic barriers. And then in this top image, this is the start of the simulation process. There's one single individual, which I've circled to make a little bit clearer. And as the simulations ran, this individual reproduced and spread across the landscape. And you can see more little green dots across the landscape. The second scenario we looked at was a dynamic or changing landscape to represent the uplift of the Andes Mountains and the formation of the Amazon rivers. And the final landscape spatial scenario we looked at was a static landscape where the barriers are fixed and present throughout the simulation process. So the species must jump across the rivers and mountains via a jump dispersal probability. And in addition to these simulations making these output maps, they're also recording the evolutionary histories of the individuals that you see as little dots on the pictures. So to determine if these simulations produced different evolutionary patterns, we first looked at the variation in topological patterns produced under each of the 3 scenarios. And we did this by assigning each tip in a tree to an endemic area in the Amazon. And then we calculated pairwise Robinson-Folds distances among all the trees produced in the simulation. So in this top left figure, we have Robinson-Folds distance on the y-axis, which you can think of as the amount of variation among the area topologies. And then on the x-axis are our 3 separate spatial scenario models, which are described in a key to the right. So we can see that the dynamic model in this case produced the least amount of variation among area topologies, while the model without any geographic barriers produced the highest variation. And these results are exciting because they're showing that our 3 separate spatial scenarios are producing 3 separate patterns. So next we looked at the amount of species diversity produced by each of the models as determined by a species delimitation method. And then this bottom left box plot, we see that the no barriers model produced the least amount of species or the least amount of diversity. But what's somewhat surprising is that the dynamic and static models produced very similar levels of diversity here. Lastly, we used ABC model selection and examined which model had the highest probability of explaining the diversity with each of these rainforest bird lineages as shown on the y-axis. So on the y-axis are all the bird lineages that we have empirical data for. And a pattern that's clear in this graph is that there is considerable variation in the probabilities of the different models across the species. So for some species, such as Attila, which I've underlined at the bottom, we can see that based on these posterior probabilities, we would reject the dynamic and static models. Whereas for other species, such as Glyphorhynchus, based on the probability, we would reject the null model. And for others yet, all 3 models are equally likely. So given that we only looked at species diversity here, it will be interesting to see the probabilities of these models when we bring in additional summary statistics. But at this point, we have an understanding of the variation in similarity and evolutionary patterns produced by alternative diversification models We found support that single models are unlikely to explain the diversification of communities. Thank you so much.